The Holocaust. It's one of those events in history that just leaves you speechless. We all know what happened, but the question that really gets under your skin is how. Not just how physically, but how psychologically. Today, we're going to dive into some really challenging source material that tries to answer that, looking at the deep, unconscious forces that allowed the unthinkable to actually happen.
And that really is the haunting question, isn't it? Because this wasn't some primitive, barbaric outburst. No, this was a project, an industrial project, carried out with all the tools of a modern, civilized nation. We're talking bureaucracy, science, law, all of it. So how on earth do you even start to wrap your head around that?
The source material has this incredible phrase for it: civilized barbarianism. And that paradox, right there, is where we need to begin. The argument is that if you really want to understand this, you can't just look at politics or economics. You have to go deeper, way deeper. We're talking about the very architecture of the human mind. So we're going to be using a psychoanalytic lens to try and make sense of it.
All right, so let's get into the psychoanalytic toolkit. Before we can even touch the main argument, we've got to understand the basic framework. The idea here is that our reality, our whole sense of self, is built on three different kind of overlapping realms of the mind. Now, these aren't actual places in your brain, but more like different operating systems for how we process the world, ourselves, and, everyone else.
First up, we have what's called the imaginary. This is all about images, the ego, and this deep-seated fantasy of being whole. You know that classic example of a baby looking in a mirror for the first time and going, "Hey, that's me"? That's the imaginary in a nutshell. It's this powerful craving for a perfect, seamless self-image. It hates anything that suggests we're flawed or incomplete. It's a total fantasy of purity and control.
Okay, next up is the symbolic. This is basically the world we're all born into, the world of language, of laws, of all the social rules. Language is amazing, right? It lets us communicate, but it also means we can never perfectly say what we feel. There's always a gap. Psychoanalysis calls this a fundamental lack. And here's the twist. This lack isn't a bad thing. It's what drives us. It's the reason we have desire, why we make art, build things, fall in love. We're always trying to bridge that gap. The symbolic is all about accepting that this incompleteness is just part of being human.
And last, we've got the real. Now, this is tricky. The real is not what we usually mean by reality. Think of the real as the raw, horrifying, unspeakable stuff that completely shatters our world. It's the kind of trauma that words and images just can't touch. In a way, you could say that both the imaginary and the symbolic are basically just giant, complicated defense mechanisms we build to keep us from ever having to look the real straight in the eye.
So, okay, imaginary, symbolic, real. How does any of this help us understand something as horrific as the Shoah? Well, this is where it gets intense. The source argues that the psychic engine driving this whole catastrophe was basically a head-on, violent collision between two of these realms. A total war, really, between the imaginary and the symbolic.
And this right here is the absolute core of the argument. On one side, you've got the entire Nazi project. You can think of it as a desperate, frantic escape into the imaginary. It's this fantasy of a perfect, pure community, the Volksgemeinschaft, right? A seamless, powerful image with absolutely no cracks, no flaws, no divisions. And then on the other side, you have what the source calls the Jewish figure, which it frames as the ultimate representation of the symbolic. And it makes sense when you think about it. A tradition built around abstract law, a god you can't even make an image of, a sacred temple where the holiest of holies was an empty space. It's a worldview that has lack, that acceptance of incompleteness built right into its very core.
So you can immediately see the clash, right? If your whole political project is based on this fantasy of pure, seamless, perfect identity, well, the very existence of a group that represents the opposite, that represents abstraction, lack, and the void, it's not just an irritation. It becomes an existential terror. It's like a horrifying mirror that reflects back the very emptiness, the very lack that the whole Nazi project was designed to escape from.
Okay, so that's the psychic conflict. But how does something so abstract, this psychic terror, turn into the physical reality of industrialized mass murder? Well, the source material lays out a path that is, frankly, chilling in its step-by-step logic.
The first key mechanism is a concept called abjection. Now, this isn't just prejudice or dislike. Abjection is that deep, gut-level revulsion. It's the feeling you get from, say, a dead body or filth. It's when a society, in a desperate quest to become pure, points to a group and says, They are the contamination inside us, and once you do that, the only logic is to violently expel them to feel clean again.
And of course, you see this everywhere in Nazi rhetoric. They didn't talk about Jewish people as political rivals. No, the language was always biological. They were a cancer, parasites, plague-bearing rats. And that language is incredibly powerful because it deliberately takes the whole issue out of politics and puts it into the category of, well, hygiene. And what's the logic of hygiene? You don't argue with a disease, you eliminate it.
But here's where it gets even more terrifying. It wasn't just the words. The truly unique horror was that the Nazis didn't just smash everything and descend into chaos. Quite the opposite. They took the very tools of civilization, that symbolic order of law, science, bureaucracy, and they didn't break them. They hollowed them out. They inverted them, turning them into perfectly efficient instruments of death.
Yeah, think about the Nuremberg laws. This is the absolute key example. Law is supposed to mediate desire, create boundaries, organize society. But here, the law itself became an obscene command to transgress. It became an order from the highest authority to exclude, to dehumanize, and ultimately to exterminate.
And then there's the cruelty, the sheer excessive cruelty in the camps that had no military or practical purpose. What was that about? Well, the source suggests this points to a really dark psychic drive, something psychoanalysis calls jouissance. And this is not pleasure. It's a painful, almost obscene kind of enjoyment. The deep-seated fantasy was that the victim held some kind of secret to life, some vital substance, and all the ritualistic torture was a perverse attempt to rip it out of them, to steal it.
So you take all these pieces, the flight into the imaginary, the war on the symbolic, abjection, the perversion of law, this drive for jouissance, and you put them all together. And this psychoanalytic framework leads to a final, really unsettling conclusion, not just about the Nazis, but about the nature of civilization itself.
This table here does a great job of laying it all out. Let's just walk through it for a second. Look at the top, the psychoanalytic idea of the imaginary. In Nazi ideology, that becomes the myth of the pure Aryan race. And in Nazi practice, it becomes the massive spectacle of the Nuremberg rallies, this giant monumental architecture. Or jump down to the abject. Ideologically, it's the propaganda of Jews as parasites. In practice, it's the ghettoization and ultimately the systematic extermination. You can see this terrifying line for each concept, connecting an abstract idea directly to the real-world machinery of death.
And that brings us to the final, absolutely chilling takeaway from this whole analysis. The Shoah wasn't a failure of civilization. It wasn't a case where civilization just collapsed and some ancient barbarism took over. No, it was a revelation. A horrifying revelation that civilization's most advanced tools, its laws, its science, its bureaucracy, could be completely hollowed out and weaponized to serve an unimaginable death drive.
And that leaves us with a question that's, well, it's pretty haunting. We put all our faith in these structures, right? Law, science, bureaucracy. They're supposed to keep us safe, keep order. But if this analysis is right, and those very things can be turned inside out to serve mass extermination, then what really holds barbarism back? What's our actual defense? That's the question this whole thing forces you to ask, and honestly, it's a question that doesn't go away.